Good day to you all. I'm Stewart McLaughlin. I'm the Honorary Curator of the Wandsworth Prison Museum. Obviously, due to lockdown restrictions and COVID being present, it's not been possible to open the museum for what would have been a wonderful weekend as part of the Wandsworth Heritage Festival. So I've come along today to give a short talk about Wandsworth Prison, not so much its general history, but more about the period of time which was probably its most difficult, and most difficult probably until more recent times. That would be the Second World War. Now, the jail itself in 1939 was very typical, a big, large London local prison taken from the courts. A variety of prisoners, from people under sentence of death to fine defaulters and some civil matters for contempt. But with the outbreak of war on the 3rd of September 1939, no doubt people sat at home listening to the broadcast from Neville Chamberlain. The governor at the time was Captain R.C. Williams, and the prison received a reception. Very unusual for a Sunday. Prison receptions are not normally open. In fact, invariably they're closed. And despite various reports of prisons emptying their prisoners out on the declaration of war, that didn't take place. Sundays is not a discharge day for prisoners. It's not now, and it wasn't back then. However, on the 4th, 5th and 6th, there were a number of prisoners released under special licence, which were amounting to anything to 100 to 200 prisoners during the course of that first week of the declaration. The prisoner that arrived at Wandsworth on the 3rd of September was George Owens. He had connections with Welsh nationalism, and his loyalties did appear divided. He was given a cell at Wandsworth, interrogated by MI5, and looked like he could potentially be a double agent. And he wasn't with us for very long, but just long enough for him to be removed to more secure accommodation elsewhere. With the prison emptying out as many prisoners as it could do in that first week, life in the jail continued, but under particular orders. The code name for the prison orders were called Seal Proceed, which gave standard procedures for all prisons around the country for continuing with the normal regime as they ran, the reception of prisoners, also the potential of special courts being set up in the event of a breakdown of the civil society. Captain Williams was assisted by a number of deputy governors, one of them being Edmund James Patton Walsh. And Patton Walsh himself had previously been in the army and was deputy governor at Wandsworth from 1936. He found himself back in uniform and eventually left Wandsworth. He went on to look after the British zone of occupation and the German prisons there, and he returned to Wandsworth as governing governor in the late 50s. There are numerous air raid precaution warnings set off during those first few weeks of the Second World War, some of them purely as tests. The prison itself had to provide its immediate first aid for fire, injury, and dealing with any other damage due to bombing. And the prison did come under attack, but not properly until 1940. There appeared to have been very little bombing around the 1939 period. The main problem that the governor had was that some prisoners didn't like being locked in their cells, particularly during air raids, although the prison itself was an excellent blast-proof shelter, but a direct hit would obviously take out a considerable amount of masonry. But the prison continued working, came through 1939 and then into 1940. Although the one major event probably for the prison in 1939 was the formation of the Prison Officers Association, which was the national trade union for prison officers in September 1939. And local branches formed thereafter. The first chairman of the Wandsworth branch was Bill Tye, but he was in Bolingbroke Hospital recovering from a minor surgery. But come 1940, and what a period of time known as the Phoney War, or at least for those service personnel on land, for the Royal Navy, it was somewhat different. Sea warfare began immediately. And with the fall of France in 1940, there were issues inside the jail regarding what eventually came with air attacks. But by 1940, Governor Williams had left to become a prison commissioner, and he was replaced by Major Grew. Major Grew was ex-army, but he, like a lot of ex-army officers who joined the prison service, retained their ranks as honorary titles. And Major Grew was the governor for Wandsworth for most of the Second World War, and he was living in the governor's house, which, if you face the main gate, it's the building to the left. With 1940, the first bombings started taking place, and the one that brought a particular tragedy to Wandsworth was 17th of August, and this was obviously pre-Blitz, but a bombing raid that came through Croydon and going through Collier's Wood and South Wimbledon. A temporary officer by the name of Cullen was out near his house and was actually killed by a bomb dropping. His name is actually on our remembrance for the Second World War in our chapel. And then comes 1940 and September, where bombing starts getting very heavy, and the governor at the time actually then wrote in the journal that he wasn't going to refer to bombing unless the jail was actually hit. And in September 1940, we had a raid on South London, which Wandsworth Prison was clearly a target, as there were at least 10 bombs that fell inside the prison walls. Governor Grew was on the basement landing of A Wing with a principal officer, and they just cleared the landing of prisoners who were working with sewing machines and got them back to behind the doors of their cells when the bombs dropped. It demolished the ventilation stack on the roof of A Wing, and that also led to the blast going into the basement, which blew Governor Grew and the principal officer from one end of the landing to the other. Although bruised and a bit battered, neither of them received fatal injuries. The 1940 continued, and the prison, although having reduced numbers, found itself having to collect prisoners from slightly different areas. Wormwood Scrubs has given over one of its wings to MI5, and although we'd like to think that crime in wartime may have been less because of the national effort, it was far from the case. Crime in wartime started going through the roof in terms of figures, particularly with bombings and blackouts. Criminals could quite easily empty warehouses, and even more honest people might find a bombed neighbour's house a convenient place to help themselves to anything that had been left behind that was salvageable. And murder in wartime, was someone found under rubble previously killed, or had they actually been discovered later found to have been just a victim of bombing itself? In fact, one wartime case that came to Wandsworth was was a fellow called Harry Dobkin. He had murdered his wife and buried the body in a bombed out building. When the body was discovered, it was the forensic science worker, Dr. Keith Simpson, that found that Ethel Dobkin had actually been murdered, and Harry Dobkin's alibis didn't hold any water, and he was subsequently found guilty and then executed for that crime. Back in the prison, though, with the war going on, other matters arose, particularly with one piece of legislation that had been passed in 1940 called the Treachery Act. Treason can actually only be committed by a British citizen, and there was some concern that foreign spies, or even possibly British subjects who may not be carrying out activities that could be quite considered treasonable, may escape the law. So in one piece of legislation in May 1940 went through all its various stages in the House of Commons and House of Lords, and the Treachery Act 1940 came into being. There were 16 findings of guilt under the Treachery Act, and 8 people were executed at Wandsworth, and a further 8 were executed at Pentonville. The one building close to Wandsworth, which sometimes filtered out spies, was the Royal Victoria Patriotic Building, which was the London Reception Centre, and that would largely take refugees from the continent, fishermen, families, whoever could got away from Nazi-occupied Europe, and they were processed there initially to make sure that they were who they said they were. It sometimes filtered out spies. A few got through, and they were subsequently found out by their espionage activities. The Treachery Act did leave for trials to take place mostly in camera or completely in camera, and they're all done at the Old Bailey. Some of the spies that came through Wandsworth included a prisoner by the name of Karl Richter. He was a Sudeten Czech who appears to have been dropped into Britain to look at troop movements and other military movements. But one story also said that he was over in the UK to assassinate the president in exile of Czechoslovakia. Whether that was anything to do with the assassination of Reinhard Heydrich in Czechoslovakia at a later stage, where it remains uncertain. However, Richter was found guilty and was one of the few men to have actually fought for his life whilst in the condemned cell and the execution chamber. The principal executioner at that time was Albert Pierpoint, and he was assisted by Steve Wade. And even Albert Pierpoint refers to the case in his memoirs. Richter was a very large man, and he actually managed to break the wrist strap that was pinning his arms back. And but in spite of the fight, he was eventually taken to the gallows, placed on the trapdoors, and executed. And his body remains in Wandsworth to this day. Other matters that occurred during the prison was the lack of availability of ARP materials, air raid precautions, and the Prison Officers Association were quite vocal that they needed steel helmets, they needed more equipment so that they could actually deal with the incendiary bombs that would occasionally drop on the prison, so they'd be extinguished quickly. The air raid shelters at the back of the prison, which were for staff families, were constantly being waterlogged. And as one entry that was placed in the POA minute book was that if the water couldn't be pumped out, could at least be changed. Probably an element of dark humour there. But from the Deputy Governor's son, Tony Pratton Walsh, who was quite a young boy at the time, he has very clear memories of being taken in with staff families into the prison during air raids and being located in F1, F-wing being at the time for administration and indeed holding the chapel. And the area on F1, again, would have provided excellent blast proof from bombing, but that was a particular memory that he had of being taken inside the prison. As the war years went on, there had been a change of personnel, different changes of deputy governors, but Major Grew was still very much in charge. The medical officer at the time was Dr. Roper, and correction to that, Dr. John Landers. And Dr. Landers kept a very accurate medical journal of the prisoners in his care, plus the rounds that he did. He was used, along with other medical staff, to visit people over in the Royal Victoria Patriotic Building, as well as looking after the prisoner patient care inside the jail. And he was present at most of the executions that took place. Although the records from the Governor's Journal and the Medical Officer's Journal are very clear, they were still allowed to take their leave, and if they worked a bank holiday, they could take that day off at a later stage. Again, it's probably considered by most that everyone was working flat out during the war years, but certainly the evidence of Wandsworth shows that staff were allowed to take their leave, they were allowed to have days off, and there was clearly every attempt to give people a chance to rest during that very difficult period. As the war years moved on, there were some issues regarding maintenance inside the jail, and particularly some of the bomb damage. One of the casualties of the 1940 air raid was the demolition of the Roman Catholic chapel. So services were held elsewhere for that religion. Also, there were a number of issues regarding prisoners being discharged. But one matter that came up, which wasn't as a result of Wandsworth, but it was actually the bombing of Pentonville. Now, Pentonville had been bombed a couple of times, but on the second occasion, it caused considerable damage, and the decision was made to close the jail, with the exception of a working party. The then governor at Wormwood Scrubs would then take over the operation of what was left of Pentonville, and it still was used as a site of execution. Now, on the subject of capital punishment within Wandsworth, it does appear that Wandsworth then inherited all the execution equipment from Pentonville from 1942 onwards, and retained that post-war up until the abolition of capital punishment. Most of the equipment that was manufactured outside of prisons came from a firm called John Edgington's, which is based in southeast London, and documentation from files that had been at the prison show that Wandsworth certainly seemed to take on the role of looking after this kit and equipment from 1942. Prior to that, everything had been held at Pentonville, and prior to them at Newgate. And even with the reopening of Pentonville, they never took that facility back. Now, the executions at Wandsworth during the war included spies, and latterly, at the end of the war, and after the war rather, traitors. Some of the people that came through at Wandsworth included John Amery, who had been the son of the Secretary of State for India, Leo Amery, and he had attempted to go around prisoner of war camps to recruit people to join a British unit of the German army called the British Freikorps. And when he appeared at the Old Bailey, he actually chose to plead guilty for the charge of high treason, for which only one sentence was available. And even the judge at the trial asked whether he fully understood what the implications were of going guilty. He replied in the affirmative, and he returned to Wandsworth, where he was subsequently executed in December 1945. The most famous, or possibly infamous, traitor was William Joyce, who went under the radio broadcasting nickname of Lord Haw-Haw. He wasn't, in fact, the first Lord Haw-Haw. That had been held by another British broadcaster. And although he had officially been born in America, he had always made declarations that he'd been born in Ireland prior to the foundation of the Free State. And although most of the charges against him were put aside during the course of the trial, it was decided that as he chose to travel to Germany under a British passport, he looked for the protection of the Crown and the British government, and was therefore deemed to be a British citizen, and therefore had committed treason by aiding the King's enemies. Although he changed his nationality during wartime, I understand the Treason Act doesn't allow for that, that once you go to an enemy state as a British citizen, you cannot simply change your nationality for convenience once war has been declared. Although another man who appeared initially on treason charges, Norman Bailey Stewart, he had previously been thrown out of the army as a result of being accused of espionage for Germany in the 1930s. And he had the distinction of being the last official prisoner in the Tower of London. Rather than being kept perhaps in close quarters at a place like Aldershot, he was transferred to the Tower of London, which of course was still allowing visitors in the 1930s, and people would actually see him on exercise dressed in the uniform of a Highland regiment. So the publicity surrounding the case was quite widespread. He originally went to Austria prior to the Second World War, and when the Nazis forced themselves into Austria in 1938, he had gone to the British consulate asking for help and assistance, and he was told he wasn't going to get it and he was on his own. So anything about being British and seeking protection from the British Crown, as far as he was concerned, it wasn't being offered, and he subsequently became a German citizen. He was released after serving a sentence and went to Ireland. Other traitors that came through the system included Thomas Haller Cooper, who was one of the few British subjects to have worn a German uniform and fought against our allies at the time, the Russians. He had made the decision to go to Germany. I don't know exactly when, but he was there, became a member of the German army, and at the end of the war, he was returned to Britain, faced charges, and was given a reprieve from his death sentence. He served his sentence out and pretty much went into obscurity. So that was how Britain largely dealt with its traitors at the end of the Second World War. All grown men making a mature decision, but they faced justice after their treason had been discovered. As the war went on, fortunately, bombings became less, but with the Panopticon issue, Wandsworth then had to start taking people in from courts outside of the normal catchment area. As I said at the beginning, we are a local prison, so we take from the what was the assize courts at Kingston, we would take from the Old Bailey, and we would take from the local magistrates' court, the most popular being the one based at Lavender Hill. But we had to take the prisoners from courts much further out from North East London because of Pendlebury's closure, which actually meant that the prison numbers pretty much filled up to pre-wartime levels, going over to the 800s and 900s for a prison that was already overcrowded. Other punishments that were carried out during the war included corporal punishment, and that would be the use of the cat o' nine tail across the back, or the birch across the backside. It was invariably kept for virtually charges of prison mutiny, or what's called gross personal violence for an officer, which would normally mean a member of staff actually having quite serious injuries of being attacked by a prisoner. But it was not, shall we say, a summary process. It was a team of visiting magistrates who would make a decision about whether corporal punishment would be appropriate, and then it would fall on the Home Secretary to make a decision as to whether it would be carried out. And the Home Secretary at the time, Herbert Morrison, would not always authorise the use of corporal punishment on a prisoner if he believed that it was not appropriate. The one thing that did come out through my research in the prison during the Second World War, that the rules and the standards were adhered to as much as possible. And there was very little evidence that rules were being sidestepped for the expediency and making the war as an excuse. Prisons were run, as far as I could see, as efficiently as they could be with the staffing resources available. And this actually meant that a lot of younger staff who had previously military service found themselves rejoining their military outfits and leaving the service on a temporary basis, which meant that some staff would be allowed to stay on past their retirement age, and some staff who might have not met the physical or medical requirements of previous recruitments would be allowed to join. It bolstered the numbers, and in many ways the prison was very grateful for their efforts. The one thing that came in were classed as war auxiliary officers, similarly to war auxiliary police, but invariably they would be kept on a number of duties, perhaps away from direct contact with prisoners. You've got to remember back in the 1940s that 90% of work carried out were by uniformed prison officers, and although there were some civilian grades, it was still mostly prison officers doing the work, gates, receptions, a lot of administration paperwork dealing with prisoners as well. It was as the war went on that ideas came through regarding peace and the end of the war, and there doesn't appear to have been much by way of internal celebration. Very little is recorded from governors' journals, medical officers' journals, or even the minute books of the Prison Officers Association. But what was clear as the war finally drew to a close was a great sense of relief that it was over. It had been a very difficult time for the prison, and without doubt, under the leadership of Major Groom, who did leave in 1940 and was replaced by Governor Leslie Ball, he did consider that his time at Wandsworth during the Second World War, although difficult, had been his most rewarding. Now, some of the other prisoners that came Wandsworth way included conscientious objectors. It was a very different setup than the First World War, and the boards that would determine a person's belief in conscientious objection would quite often offer alternatives. But some people who had the moral issue of not wishing to raise arms against anybody, a few did find themselves in Wandsworth. One notable prisoner who was kept in Wandsworth was the father of Jack Straw, the late Home Secretary. But the general feeling of the treatment of conscientious objectors in Wandsworth was that one actually returned to the prison after release to say thank you to Governor Grew. And I know another, Peter Brock, who was a conscientious objector. He saw, possibly two sides of the treatment of these types of prisoners, but it did come across that in wartime, the officers simply got on with the job that they needed to do, and there didn't appear to be much singling out of those who were in prison for reasons of objecting because of their moral their moral compass, their religious beliefs, or simply their humanist beliefs. So there is very little evidence compared to what took place during the First World War of any ill treatment of conscientious objectors. The final endings of the war in Wandsworth did actually bring about one unique event, which is the landing of a V2 rocket in March 1945. It took a little bit of research, but the Governor's Journal, the Medical Officer's Journal, was very clear that a V2 rocket had fallen by the Deputy Governor's house, causing damage to that and one of the wings of the prison. There's also notes in the visiting committee book of Pentonville, which had obviously started to take prisoners, that they had to take prisoners from Wandsworth as a result of the rocket attack. But probably the most poignant memory of that was, again, the Deputy Governor's son, Tony Patton Walsh. He was aged about 9 or 10 at the time. And the resulting missile attack actually damaged the sight in one of his eyes. So it does remain that Wandsworth Prison is probably the only British prison to have been attacked by a missile. The other bomb damage that the prison took was actually repaired reasonably quickly. The RC Chapel was eventually rebuilt. It's a relatively simple structure, rectangular building, so that was put back in consequently after the war's end. The prison itself had no bomb casualties apart from the temporary officer in 1940. There's no record of anyone having been killed as a result of 5 years. However, some staff, Cecil Groom, a prison officer, he was killed in Italy. And then there was Officer Strickland, he was killed in Germany. And then there was also Officer Upton, who was also killed during the conflict. So only 3 officers who had returned to military service had actually been killed during that conflict. There is a correction there. It was not Officer Strickland. He was killed in the First World War. The officer that I'm referring to is Officer Craggs, who was killed in the Second World War. And he was killed actually in Germany in June as a result of some accident as part of the occupation forces. And I think it's interesting to note that the prison has agreed to put together a history book that I've been working on regarding the Second World War. And it's had a number of delays in getting printed because of COVID-19. There are some comparators regarding the restrictions of regimes, the staffing problems, and the concerns and the worries of a whole nation that we look at today that was faced back during the war years. Yes, slightly different circumstances, but the pressure on everyone in and outside the prison is certainly there for us all to observe and us all to endure. So in closing, I would say that, in the words of Major Grew, that it was the most difficult but the most rewarding of times, and perhaps we can take a little bit of that into the present day.